Hey, Wes here. Thanks for joining me today. Appreciate that. And today I am going to start painting this saucer bowl. They're called saucer bowls because they look like flying saucers. And I'm going to do it in the Sikyatki tradition. Well, what is that? Well, I'm going to put some various pictures of old pots up there so you kind of get an idea what it looks like. But Sikyatki was the name of a village at Hopi. And it is actually, it's prehistoric, some of it actually, but the Spaniards showed up and would have seen some of this pottery. But Sikyatki, 1375 to 1625, the Spaniards showed up in 1540. But it is characterized by polychromes. One, it has lots of colors, not one or two, sometimes three, four, five. It would have obviously black and red, but lots of Southwest pottery was, if they used red, it'd be a solid red. But with Sikyatki, it could have texture to it. Maybe they would use washes or stippling, a lot of variation. They would also do engraving or scraffito. Maybe they would have more than one color of red. Maybe there would be two or three, or in colors of brown and white and yellow. Just amazing stuff. And then the iconography, the actual images were incredible. In my mind, this is the high art of Southwest pottery. And it's what I really like to do. And so what I try to do is look at the old stuff and try to emulate that in one way or another. So all of the images that I put on this thing will be my own, but obviously influenced from the past. So I'm going to get this thing laid out. I'm going to show you some different painting techniques that I use, and let's get started. Most Native American pottery is pretty symmetrical, and Sikyatki was as well, but not always. And I don't know if you can tell, I've decided I'm going to have 6 panels. And I don't know if you can see, but I have actually sketched these out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then almost always you would see a band that would go around the top. And actually in the old ones, they would have a gap in that band. I don't put those gaps in. I am not a native person. I don't think I have that right to do it. And then there would be a band or two on the bottom as well. These are the kinds of brushes I use for lining. They're human hair brushes. They're from my granddaughter. Unfortunately, she has just a little bit of curl to her hair, and that makes it a little bit more difficult. I would love to get some really super fine, super straight hair to make more brushes. But I'm going to start with this one and see how it goes. One thing that is typical with Sikyatki is that lots of the designs, not all of them, but lots of the designs are outlined in black. Kind of like a coloring book in a way, and I don't mean to minimize it. So that's what I do. I draw in all of my main lines first, and then I add the color. And quite frankly, almost all of this stuff gets done twice. I'll do the main ones first, do the color, then go back over everything, clean it up. And I'll try and show you along the way how I do it. But the nice thing about these long brushes like this is that they just kind of create their own line. In terms of brush strokes, one of the things I try to do oftentimes to get an even line is lay the whole brush down. So I'm not painting only with the tip of the brush. I paint with the entire length of the brush. One thing that makes a huge difference, I think, in the painting is just if you've got a pot that's pretty smooth, you get much more even lines. And also a clean brush. I wash my brush out really often. Otherwise it builds up little bits of mineral. Gets globby, doesn't work very well. These are the main lines. Now I just have to figure out how to fill in each of these panels with. All of these panels are going to be sun motifs, so I need 3. So what I typically do is draw something out. It won't turn out exactly like this, but it'll be more or less like this. I am not able to freehand a circle. Probably 90% of everything here is freehanded, but I will trace out a circle on here to get this all started, and then the rest I will do by hand. So I've oftentimes wondered what the native people used when they painted, and did they freehand everything? And they may have, but I doubt it. I suspect that just like any other human, they would use whatever aids they had available to them. So there are plenty of straight things in the natural environment, say like a yucca leaf or something like that. And some of that stuff that they do is so finely done, I just don't see how it could have been done freehand. So, is it cheating to use a bottle cap to draw a circle? Yeah, maybe, but I don't think so. I think they probably would have used whatever they could that would give them the result they were looking for, and to do it easily and effectively. The basic outline of this panel is complete. Both turned out more or less the same. And the fun, though, is when we fill in the colors for all the different little sections. But I'll get all the other panels outlined first, and then move on to the color. Here is the design for the next section, and bam, here it is. So 4 sections done, 2 more to go. Here is the design for the last 2 panels, and bam, here they are. Turned out okay. They're not the same, not intended to be. The little shapes are expected to be a little bit bigger so I can paint inside of them. So next step is to start filling in all these little spaces. That's the fun part. The sections between each of the panels are going to be solid black, and then I'm going to etch on those. I'll show you how that works later. For this kind of thing, I typically try and use a kind of a flat brush. I do not worry about getting it all done at one time. I will go over it a couple times probably, and in fact I use pretty wet paint with long strokes to try and eliminate kind of the seam marks. That's probably not the right word. That is as good as I'm going to do it this time. I'll come back through and do it again. What I don't do is use a little brush like this and then have choppy little marks, because they will show up. I want it to be a flat black in this particular case. So if you watch this, watch what happens to the paint. See, it looks to me, and I don't know if you can see it, it goes dull right away. It's soaking into the pot, and that is exactly what I want to have happen. And the reason is that the particles of the paint are very tiny, and they will soak into the pores of the clay, and then they'll just fire better. And I rarely have issues with fugitive paint because of this. With banding, I try to have a brush that's about as wide as the band itself. And I have seen some pots where it was pretty clear that they would make these bands with one stroke. They weren't going over it like I am. So clearly they were confident and very competent as well. I have the banding on the bottom and the top and all the section pieces done once, but I will have to go over these one more time to make sure that everything is one good solid color. then I can start filling in all these little pieces. Okay, I'm kind of tired of black, so let's switch over to red paint. This is just a red clay. It's a natural clay. And basically what I'm doing with all of these different shapes is coloring them in. And I try to pay attention to alternate the colors, so red isn't next to red and black next to black and so on. This is real basic painting, and actually that's what most of the painting from the desert Southwest was. It's just a solid color. So let's move on to some other colors that aren't solid. So one of the textures that I want to talk about is stippling, and for that I use a brush, short hairs, and stiff, because I'm just going to use the very tip of the brush. I'll show you what I mean. I don't want very much paint on it. This paint here is just a red clay, very finely produced red clay. I just dab it on a little bit, and then usually I'll take a piece of paper and test it so I don't get, the risk is getting too much paint. So let's just start right here. So you're just barely dabbing it on to the pot. You also might want to rotate the brush, otherwise it will kind of create a pattern, and I think what I'm after here is randomness. You can make it very light or very dense. It just depends how much you want. Something like that. So that works reasonably well, I think. And here is an example of stippling in a fired pot, and what it might look like. With this texture, I want to have a gradient, and quite frankly, I'm not sure that I've seen that in Native American pottery. So what I want is it to be dark on the middle and lighten up on the outside. I'll show you. Hopefully it works. It doesn't always work. So I put down a fair amount of paint on the dark side and then just flick it out. You need to have a stiff brush and you can't have very much paint. Very light touch to this. And I might come back. Maybe I want it a little bit darker. So I'm always thinking about being consistent and having balance to all of this. So I'm going to do this side as well. What I really don't want in this case are too obvious of brush strokes. So when that fires, that should be fairly dense in the middle and lighten out. Hopefully it shows a little bit of flow and depth. That's the goal anyway. Here is an example of the blending once the pot's been fired. Or up on the top, here's another example. Another option is to create a wash. For this, I'll use a soft brush and more water than paint. I want to make a really thin application of water and not very much paint. So this is more like watercolor. So the underlying clay or paste material will kind of show through. And I randomly squiggle the brush around so that some areas have thick paint, little ridges, and some areas have thin paint. So that's not a solid color at all, and actually will, I think, probably end up looking really good. So here is my palette of how many different colors I have on it. So I would never use all of these colors on one pot, but I might conceivably use 4 or 5. So this is a yellow here, and I'm going to continue with this wash. So one option with a wash, if you can see that here, is just one color. But what happens if we add a little bit of a second color? I'm not going to add much. And this is yellow, and this won't even show up much now or even once it's fired. But I think it gives more interest, and that'll dry too. So usually with yellow, it's such a light color. I don't usually do stippling with that, but I might add it to a second color to give more depth, or use it individually. Or you can see these other colors here, whites and browns, and usually the yellows turn some kind of red or pinkish color. So I may use different colors to just give more variety. Here is an example of wash after firing with red paint. And over on this side, wash with yellow paint. The next thing I want to talk about isn't so much about texture, but giving variety. So I have shapes like this that I plan to fill in, but just because it's this one shape, it doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. So another option is to keep it that shape, but divide it up. Now I'll show you what I mean here. So now what I will do, and I'll show you this, I'll paint this piece and this piece the same color, and then the middle piece, I could leave it plain because this is going to turn kind of a buff color, or I could paint the middle piece a different color. Or I could do one other thing. I could maybe divide the bar again. So because this is red, I want a different color next to it so it stands out. So we're going to use some black. So I think on these two pieces right there, I'm going to use yellow. This particular yellow is not a real dark yellow. It's a little hard to control, quite frankly. But that's another possibility of just breaking up your images so that they create maybe some more interest. Another technique, I'm not going to use it on the bowl I'm painting, but what you did see in some cases was spattering. And so the way I do it is I take a brush with stiff bristles. I've cut these bristles down real short. It's kind of like a toothbrush. And I get it wet on the end. And then I flick it with my finger. Hopefully you can see this. And so you can do it as much or as little as you want. And I'll show you a picture of some spattering. And one way that sometimes they used it is to create like a template or an outline, and everything gets spattered around that outline. The basic painting is complete. So now what I need to do is just kind of go over all of these areas that are supposed to be black, but the pot is showing through. And so going over it the second time is really quite a lot easier than doing it the first time. Now I have to deal with these black panels. I could leave them just as I want, but I am going to use scraffito, which I'm not sure what that means. That's an Italian word. I think it means to inscribe, something like that. And there is evidence of this kind of thing in the desert Southwest. So I have come up with some different symbols that are meaningful to me that I plan to scratch in. And so I have a little awl. You could use a nail, lots of different kinds of things. If your clay is pretty smooth, then it's fairly easy to draw straight lines. So that works out pretty well, I think. So here is one panel that's finished, so you can see why it's important to have a good, solid paint base to work with. Things show up a little bit more. Okay, the scraffito part is done. It turned out okay from my perspective. Almost done with the project. There's just one area that needs to be taken care of. And if you can see that there's a number of areas where I didn't paint within the lines. It kind of smeared over, and that's not uncommon. So what I need to do is take my liner brush and go over any areas where the lines are not clear. This is a really good example down here. It doesn't take a whole lot, but it will really sharpen things up. Give you an example of what I try to do without messing it up. Hopefully you can see I don't go over every line. I just go over the ones that don't seem particularly clear. Okay, I would say that is done. The only thing necessary is to put a name on the bottom. It's cleaned up pretty good. The saucer pot is all painted. It just needs to be fired, and I'm anxious to get that done. Hopefully you found these different painting techniques to be interesting and useful. Hopefully you go out and try some of these things and then come up with your own techniques as well and come up with your own designs. I think the sky really is the limit when we look at this kind of art form. So thanks so much for being here. If you like this, thumbs up are great. Subscriptions are wonderful, and I really love those comments. Until next time, this is Wes, wishing you health, happiness, peace, and love. Take care. Bye-bye.